he makes it sound like a AM transistor radio.
Yeah.
And go to him and go, hold on a second, I've got this great PA. He'll look at you and say, well, this is how the music was recorded when we put this out. So this is how I want it to be transmitted. So yeah, you lose all high fidelity.
Yeah, there's some singers that I've seen that some of my friends have worked with, which really want that sort of thin sound. And it was kind of shocking to me because the recordings don't sound that way, but they do live, and they're extremely sensitive. And this particular singer I'm thinking of doesn't use monitors. Not naming names, but just saying it. I was a little bit surprised by it.
So we're live on the YouTubes. I just sort of just did it. I keep trying to do super fancy intros, and I'm not into that. So we're live.
We're over it.
If you want to share the link on your Facebooks or your Instagrammy things or whatever, just click on the little thing that says live on YouTube, and you can get a link and you can post it up. I'm doing that right now. Because and the great part is that the thumbnail right now is Dave looking like he's passing gas, so that's just perfect. So that's definitely going up on the Facebook. All right,
awesome.
So, let's do our little magic intro video.
Yeah, well, that's like just your opinion, man.
So welcome to the Audio Opinion Show, where a bunch of audio guys get together and get opinionated, because this is just what we're super, super good at. I'm joined by lots of friends. Nearly everybody that I see, I've either worked with on site or done other things, just kind of by happenstance this time. I actually didn't ask Andrew. I'm positive that I've worked with you before, but I can't remember exactly what it is that you do audio related.
I'm an A1 and an A2 based in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, and you do mostly like sound reinforcement stuff?
Sound reinforcement, a lot of corporate events.
Gotcha.
It's my bread and butter, and we've been on a few of these types of Zooms with
cool.
other
right.
avenues.
We're almost all sound reinforcement guys today. So I'm not going to bore everybody by going around and telling everybody's name and saying that they're mostly sound reinforcement folks, because it's a sound reinforcement kind of day. So we're just going to launch right into it with, of course, the first poll. As soon as I figure out, I have this problem every time.
Inconceivable.
Inconceivable. No, seriously, where's my polling?
Nice name, Mac.
Talk amongst yourselves, because I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, there it is. It moved to a
Good
poll.
to see you too.
All right. So we're going to launch a poll, and the poll is, what's your favorite movie? And the actual question is The Big Lebowski the greatest movie of all time? Possible answers: yes. Obviously no. And I thought this was an audio show, so I'll submit my answer. Tabulating. I'm going to keep this bit going until everybody quits. So just so we're clear, this stupid movie bit. All right. So I thought this was an audio show wins. So apparently this is an audio show. I'm still going to do the bit at least one more time. So that's just a warning in advance. All right. I think I shared that. All right. Put that one away. So let's figure out what we're actually going to talk about today. Why is it? Oh, it's this one. All right. So let's do this poll. So you guys should all see that on your screens. And it says topic 3 because it doesn't matter. So this is what we're going to talk about today to start with. Our choices are crank up genie towers. Are they the spawn of the devil? Meyer versus Martin versus JBL versus DMB versus L Acoustics versus whatever. Let's talk speakers. Favorite console, least favorite console. Console channel layouts. Do you like drums first? Do you do different things? Shure versus Sennheiser versus Electrosonics. That should be fun. And the one that I mentioned earlier, sound reinforcement versus a larger than life sound. So these are our options. Choose wisely, choose once. I've got, this could be a close one. I've got, everybody's in, by a nose. Okay. So I've shared it, and it looks like what we were talking about earlier is actually going to be our topic, by a nose. But if we veered off into favorite console, that wouldn't break my heart either. So there you go. So we are doing sound. Do we do sound reinforcement? Do we make it larger than life? What is our goal in what we're doing? Anybody want to lead off with a comment?
Whatever the artist wants.
Could you elaborate on that?
The audience.
I was going to say it depends. Like we haven't heard that one before.
Right.
Well, it also depends on what are you mixing front of house? Are you mixing monitors? Are you mixing for broadcast, etc.? There's lots of different people to please who all have different opinions about that. And
sometimes they're all in the same room together too.
Yeah, right. And sometimes even the person who signs the check isn't the one that makes the decision.
Right.
You got to figure that out.
But that is why there's separate mixes.
That they cash to send you a check is the person you really have to please.
Well, I can only approach it personally from the idea of mixing monitors. So many of your clients will come to you and say, I want it to sound like the record. So you make it sound like the record. That's not what ends up happening at the end of the day.
Right.
And it can go in either direction. Some of them want it to sound huge, enormous with their vocal way down in the middle. And others want the vocal all the way on top with everything else barely audible and maybe a piano and a time percussion. You just never know.
I have an artist that I tour with and I mix front of house with and for. And I was initially making things sound like the album. And the lead singer from the artist came to me and said, what are you doing? So I'm making it sound like the album. He said, no, this is a live show. We're rock and roll. Just make it loud. And my voice has to be over everybody else, which, okay, make it loud. That was what he wanted. He just wanted it loud. None of the effects that were on the album, none of that. Just, present it as a straight up rock show. You never know what you're going to get, right?
It's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
I thought this was an audio show, not a show.
My mother-in-law always knew because she carved a hole in the bottom of every one in the box.
Yeah. Well, see, that was always the thing when we were kids. I always went in and, they had the labeling on top that, said what everything was. And then you just moved them all to different places and closed the lid back and then laughed at your sister because she hated caramel. Just saying I'm not saying that's a thing that I did. So, but nobody's really mentioned style of music. It's just,
I was going to jump in on that. I was going to take off from the orchestra point of view because we were talking about that before, and I'm an orchestra musician and done some acoustic gigs and so on. But even with the symphony, I would say there's 3 different distinct, clear styles, and they have to be mixed differently. If it's supposed to be really symphonic, like pure classical music type stuff, you really have to be careful not to overmix it and make it sound bigger than life. It should sound as if you're in a concert hall, which if you're outside needs some enhancement. But then the next thing from that is going to be a pop show, which should sound a little different because you've got drums in the mix and electric bass probably, and the vocals should sound more like pop vocals and so on. And therefore the strings have to come up and all that. Then there's movie soundtrack type concerts. Some of these are live movie presentations where they screen the movie and have a live orchestra, and it should sound like the movie soundtrack, which is definitely larger than life. I mean, recording an orchestra for a movie is done very differently than recording an orchestra for, let's say, a Beethoven symphony, that kind of thing. And that's kind of what the audiences expect. I mean, to Jason's point, it's what the artist wants, and that's typically what they'll want, but also the audience expectation. You know, if they're coming to hear it and expect to see movie, they're going to want to hear a movie style version of that symphony.
Well,
Well,
I,
if you-
go ahead, Pete. It looks like you were.
Oh, yeah, no, I just, yeah, man, like, there's a lot of different clients giving input, the lead singer's wife or the manager or the group of managers or, you know, whomever. But in my
The lead
experience,
singer's girlfriend is a possibility too.
sure,
Wife's
yeah,
not the only one with an opinion.
we're politicians.
Or boyfriend.
And
How-
to make it even more confusing, you sometimes look at the disconnect between Nashville pop country music that you'd hear on the album, the radio, live. Some of these acts have Marshall stacks
But-
cranking.
But here's the thing, though, like most of the time, if you, like someone said, mixing it like the album, I think that if you take that concept and put a live feeling, people go to concerts to experience the music in a more enhanced way than they can listen to in their home, no matter the genre. And so like I did a Janet Jackson tribute where we had a house band that was really good. I made them sound like the record because that was the intent. And like I received zero input from nearly everyone on the way it sounded. But then like, you know, one of my clients is an opera house. They do a musical every year that's a proper musical that's reinforced. Their constituents aren't used to reinforced audio. But if we can make the orchestra sound just a little bit enhanced, a little bit there where they're like, wow, you know, I've never heard the tremolo on those violins in this room before because the orchestra is in the opera house pit. And it's, you know, so I think that if the approach is less defined by genre and more just what can I do to take this music and provide a enhanced version of it for the audience, then that's a good starting place for feedback from whoever's paying you or whoever's in the band, right?
So I was a house engineer for a very long time at a 600 cap venue, and we saw the stars on the way up and on the way down. Rarely when they were at the top, but and many of the times they would not be touring with an engineer. I mean, we had Hanson and, you know, you name it. I mean, just people on their way up, on their way down, you know, even bands like Cheap Trick, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd have to mix bands that I've never heard before. I'm just curious I know how I handled it. In the first 30 seconds, I got a feel for what they were doing. Half time we didn't even get a sound check. It was just a line check. And
that's part of the talent of knowing how to mix, right? Like you get a vibe of the band, you go talk to the musicians, you kind of figure out.
There was no time to talk to the musicians.
Well, sure. No, but like, you know, like the festivals I've done festivals different ways where like I used to do all the hippie kind of folk festivals on the East Coast, Newport Jazz, sure. Gray Fox, all those. There's hundreds of bands over the weekend. You're not going to, you're mixing almost all of them, A, and B, you don't have time to really research them. So then that approach that you just mentioned, absolutely. But like, you know, I've done some South by Southwest stages where we know it's a very curated experience where you have 5 bands a day and you have time to actually research what they sound like. And you're also mixing probably all of them every day with the exception of maybe one at the end of the run or whatever, right? Yeah. And so I've done it both ways. And, but you're right. Like there is a certain amount of like, oh, I know what this is supposed to be like, you know? And
well, and
there's a standard.
The big thing, it's like the learning curve for me when I first got into doing this for reels, was exactly that. It was figuring out, what the expectation is. You know, I remember the first time I did a jazz gig And I went to put, mics all over the drums, and the drummer's like, "Did you do like what you doing? I don't need the microphones. I don't need that." And and kind of learning like, oh, he wants the drums to sound exactly like they sound when I'm standing 2 feet away from them. And if they're not clearly audible in the room, then I need to do something microphone wise to sound exactly like this, but just a little bit louder so everybody can hear it, which is, of course, nowhere close to what you want to do with pop or rock or anything else, because those drums sound nothing like drums. Like, for the most part, they are completely altered versions of drums and everything in between. And kind of managing that expectation. And I think over time you get a certain amount of a feel for, oh, this is this kind of a thing versus this is that kind of thing. And I do think you go farther in this business more quickly if you kind of learn how to, I don't know. Pete, I agree with you.
It's interesting that you mentioned drums, Brian.
Ask, but
so
you don't get a chance to ask, and you just got to kind of.
And it's interesting you mentioned drums because. Yeah, go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
In your scenario, do you put any energy or thought into trying to make from act to act consistent?
Well, that's what
other?
Yeah. So like the South by Southwest examples, because I could curate the bands and research their sound, we had control of the stage from promoter to stage manager to advance everything. And we did not allow console files because we were looking out, the client was, it was a stage for their brand. And we were looking out after the quality of their brand. And most of those bands that are unsigned don't carry technicians, and if they do, they're probably not seasoned technicians. Let's just be gentle about that, right? And so and so I know that the mix that is going all day is it drives me nuts, these festivals where it takes 3 songs to get it together. It should take less than a half a song. And whether you're dialing it in headphones or in this case of South by, it's basically the same mix. So all you're really changing is the drum sounds because and vocal effects, because everything else is probably about the same. A bass guitar, with certain exceptions, sounds the same for almost everything. For modern pop / rock / country music, a bass guitar is a bass guitar for the most part. Right.
So yes, I'm sure we all have our basic festival patches that we throw in our consoles, and we patch all the bands in, and that's our starting point for our kick drum snare.
And so if there was
we start from, and in that first 30 seconds, we're tweaking and modifying and making changes and whatever, and then we're done. I mean, then it's time to mix. So, but by the way, what does a drum sound like?
Right. How about? In those situations, you're not doing any of the fancy drum triggering pink noise on snare drums or anything like that. But you are changing this is a heavy rock band, so the kick should sound like X. But then the next band is a Southern rock jam band. Yeah, the kick is going to sound more 70s maybe or whatever. And so, but what it really comes down to is the quality of it in the end for me. And then the creative elements can come after that in a festival situation and in my opinion,
But speaking to drums and particularly to Keith, because you mentioned Cheap Trick, back in the day, we used to work with them all the time, and Bunny Carlos and Robin Zander, the singer and the drummer, extremely particular about their sound. Like Bunny Carlos is a connoisseur. He brings in different years snares and everything to handle different gigs. So in your case, Keith, or Pete, when you're coming in and you have a band like that has a known quantity, how you actually accomplish that, because Bunny Carlos's cymbals, for one thing, are amazing sounding live. They're incredible sounding and very difficult to capture.
So speak to the Cheap Trick thing, they brought their own engineer. Yay. Right. But
Okay.
I was just, so that was easy for me to handle. But there have been lots of national acts, headliners, A acts that were either on their way up or their way down that I had never heard of before. And of course, later on, we've heard of them. On their way down, we've all heard of them. And generally, I've heard their music. So how do I prepare for that? Well, if I know that I'm going to be mixing, I don't know, Hanson next week, everybody's heard Bop, right? We've all heard that song. We all get the idea of how it goes, how their music is put together. If they do come through, which that club no longer exists, so whatever. But I prepare for that. If I know for sure that I'm mixing a headliner, I will listen to their material. They advance the show, these shows get advanced. Never has anybody ever brought up, oh, by the way, put a lot of reverb on my voice or no reverb or whatever in an advance. I've never seen that in my entire life. Now, when the band gets there, their tour manager, if they have a tour manager, or whoever, maybe the singer or somebody in the band might come to me and say, hey, you've heard our stuff, mix it like the record, or, whatever. I mean, again, the band that I tour with now, well, when things come back again, they never said anything to me. They just let me go. And then the singer came to me and said, what the hell are you doing? I don't want it to sound like the album. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Had you told me ahead of time. So yeah, it's all about communication. So
how many times have people have you stepped in like, oh, our engineer's coming for this show. So, I've had a couple situations where it's like, oh yeah, he's not coming for that show. So you're going to do it. You talk to him, get his file, whatever. And I've had a couple where like, oh, you meet the band and you shake hands and you're like, oh yeah, and I got dude's file and whatever. We'll start there. And the band's like, yeah, you know what? Can you just start over? I've had Dave's. Yeah. There's a couple artists out there.
There's really another reason why he's not here.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly.
Here's some words I never want to hear. Here's the console file.
How about the ones who say we want it to sound like the record? They get up there and the inputs coming off the stage don't sound like anything on the record.
Well,
inputs are everything, man.
You got to create a sound if they don't have their own. There's that whole, the band mixes itself kind of thing where they've actually crafted something that doesn't take a lot of tweaking, but
100%.
Everything's got to have its own, space in the mix. And if they don't have that coming off stage, your job's definitely going to be a lot harder.
Yeah, and usually that comes with, like, if they've been produced in a studio, because generally they're using guitar pedals and drums that are tuned, and it's like drummers playing the click track. Usually that's learned by a producer in a studio, right? So I think like mic techniques with singers, same thing, right?
So going back to Jason though, on you get what's coming off the stage is nowhere near the record. What do you do in the cases of where what's coming off the stage is just absolutely horrible? Like metal bands are really famous for just having just crap come off the stage. And then you have to make it sound good because this is a million selling album. But the band like Randy Rhoads of Ozzy when he was alive, his offstage sound was just like in the can. It was the worst. It had narrow band. So what do you do in those cases? How do you make them sound larger in life?
You get the Olympic turd polisher out and do your best.
That may be why plugins are so popular, to embellish it, to try to, not only process it, but some of these things actually produce harmonics intentionally and alter the inputs,
Well, let's get back to that's why we need tubes. We need tubes on
Yes.
I used to actually trigger.
Bring it around.
I used to actually trigger kick drums. I'd get metal bands up on stage with no port cut in the kick, and they want that attack, and I'm like, okay, what do I do now? Well, I had my old drum sampler sitting there, and I'd take the mic and plug it into that, and it would give me that kick drum. I mean,
In the
hard
old
to do.
days, you could take a pink noise generator and a
Pink
gate
noise.
and,
I used to do
on
that,
a snare drum.
Yeah,
Yep,
sure.
100 years ago, I had
Guns
a
N'
Pro
Roses,
1.
man.
I had a sequential circuits Pro 1 tucked under my desk because I couldn't afford a real reverb. And this was back in the early 80s with the gated snare. And that white noise coming off that Pro 1 was my gated snare.
But also that brings up a good point of like you're part of the band, so therefore a dialogue between you and the band that's where that thing of like if you have time and what's coming off the stage isn't amazing, like all of the best, like getting started early. I remember, I forget the guy's name, but this was probably 1998, and Kansas was touring a lot. Like they were just touring like the shed circuits, picking up local production, and we were providing like 4Ks and 850s, right? And I just remember them sounding amazing, and I had a long talk with the guy. And the guy hated VDOS because it was new and he didn't know how to mix on it. It sounded well, but back then they were mixing to the box, not for themselves, and mixers weren't that good and all that stuff, right? So it was a different way of mixing, but his approach was dealing with the band. So like things like their Marshall half stacks were tipped almost all the way up towards the ceiling because they had to play them as loud as possible, but it was affecting his mix at front of house on those types of PAs, And so I think that goes back to just dialogue with the band. If it's non-festival and you're touring with somebody, or if it's an evening with and you're the mixer for the day and you have time during the day during their sound checks, like I don't know. And most of the time the band wants to sound good. So if you can approach them with a constructive attitude, a lot of times they'll listen,
Yeah, there are cases when you need to also, obviously always be diplomatic, but you may have to ask for, well, who ultimately makes the decision? Because this musician's bugging me about this and this other guy's bugging me about this. And, maybe there's a musical director or something like that who will make the call. And sometimes it takes you saying, hey, look, trust me, I'm the one out there, and I think the audiences are generally positive about my mixes. So you got to trust me because I don't want to mic every trumpet, or I don't want to, do this. And I've had to do that. And I think we've all had to do that. It's diplomacy.
Have you ever worked
plus
with Shana Na?
Me, no, thankfully.
They had this guitar player, and Lenny would just turn. The guitar player would start asking for like more 20 hertz in my guitar, and Lenny would turn to him and go, "Shut up." It happened all the time. It was crazy.
Yeah. Sometimes you get into all I could think for the last like 5 minutes as I'm glancing down at Jason, I'm thinking, this is why Jason only does monitors, so he doesn't have to deal with all this nonsense. It's like,
it's a whole other animal.
Yeah, because there's no nonsense in monitors.
Yeah, but you want a different mix? No problem.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
You want to hear yourself louder? Sure, fine. Here you go.
Yeah. One thought I had too, in listening to all this, is an old rule of thumb that some studio engineer told me, a million years ago, was the idea that if you're mixing a rock song, this is in the studio, but if you're mixing a rock song, start with the kick drum hitting the -10, on the VU meter, and then build your mix around that. And if it's a country song, and this is before country became totally rock, basically, or pop, but you would mix the vocals to -10 and build your mix around that. And it's always stuck with me, just the idea that, hey, these are two different musical styles, and the mix really has to be different for that reason. And, vocals are critically important. It may be the biggest mistake I've heard just going to concerts and hearing it, is the vocals aren't loud enough. And it's really all about the song. I mean, we've heard the joke, no one walks out of there humming the kick drum, I guess, unless it's one of those speed metal concerts. But it's about the words, about the lyrics, and we have to always remember that. And so bigger than life, if anything's going to be bigger than life in the mix, it really should be the vocals, and not just loud, but clear, nice and open and clear.
Carl, I agree, but there are those shows where they've said, turn the vocals down, and it's because of the style of the music.
Sure. It's style dependent. I agree. Absolutely.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah. But it always err on the side of having too much vocal. It's easier to dial that back.
What kind of show is that?
what kind of show is that? Punk, you know, or thrash metal. A lot of times they just don't want it. They want the instruments to be at the same level or even louder and kicking the ass of the vocal. They don't want to hear the vocals.
I find that
it's a weird thing, but it's true.
I think they think of the vocal as an instrument rather than the typical vocal. In other words, like it's a sound and you're hearing it together in the mix as almost like an instrumental, even though it's, you know, it's got words attached to it. But people know the words from listening to the records, and it's more about the experience. I mean, I saw Black Flag here just a few months ago. That's kind of how it was. I mean, I could hear the words, but they weren't overbearing. It was definitely loud rock.
And Karl, you do big band stuff too, and I know that a lot of times they'll ask for the vocals to be kind of on the same level as the instruments, and that's a good starting place. And then you just kick them up just a smidge.
Yeah, just to make sure it's kind of floating on top. But yeah, it shouldn't be giant vocals and then the band. I mean, the band is the feature, and the vocals are part of that.
I had a big band leader said, make her sound like she's standing there back behind the piano. That was his advice. And I think that nailed it.
I think most classical genres are that way, you know, opera or even musicals. I mean, you want intelligibility, but not completely out in front kind of pop.
Yeah, not in your face.
Yeah.
Well, also the music usually is composed in such a way that the vocal features itself when it needs to in those formats. So it's there's a little bit of natural, again, mixing of the balancing, I guess, in that case, of the voice versus the instrument, even though, yes, the voice is an instrument technically.
That's part of the arrangement.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, that's why some of those famous arrangers that, you know, did that kind of work. That's exactly what they were trying to accomplish. And, you know, they became masters in the studio for that reason. In fact, that's one of the best things you can do in a studio situation or even live. If you can talk to the band, if the band trusts you, is talk about arrangement. Like, why is the guitar playing with a dirty sound the whole time? You know, does that really make sense? And maybe it does for punk, for Black Flag, sure, but not for everything. But, you know, that's starting to meddle a little bit with the music itself. But if they really trust you, they might actually make some of those kinds of changes. You know, a big mistake that's made in a lot of mixes from the stage, from the band, is the guitars are too dirty, too distorted. And, you know, if you back that off, it really cleans things up. It still sounds punchy and aggressive, but it just doesn't have to be completely saturated. You know,
or too soaked in their own effects, like you start in their own effects.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It sounds great coming out of the amp, but when you run that through the PA, all of a sudden it's just like a wash of reverb.
It may not sound great coming out of the amp either.
It may not. Matters of opinion, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's different. The guy's ankles.
True, though,
what he's
hearing
hearing
in the
is
musician's
what's coming out of
head
the
that
amp.
matters. And
Yeah, you
making
guys
sure
are-
fader up, and you don't get any more of it in the mix because it's just so washed out that it just doesn't cut.
There's no clarity to it.
That before.
Guitar player comes at you with a stereo guitar rig with a 14-piece band. Where do I put this?
Right.
Everything's a pad at that point. If it's all chorus.
Oh man, if you guys saw some of the EQs I've had on electric guitar, you'd be like, what is he doing? But
no, you have to. I mean, it's
depending on the sound. Yeah.
You've got to sculpt it. Otherwise it'll interfere with everything that's going on. It's a wideband signal, that distorted guitar. Heavy sculpting is totally normal.
It's cool that you bring that up because when you're mixing monitors, your hands are tied. You can't do, when you're mixing a single mix, either mono or stereo, listen to the old Beatles mono mixes. They're fantastic because every instrument has a tonal signature that leaves room for every other instrument.
Yep.
When you're mixing monitors, everybody has to be on top in their own mix.
Right.
So you're stuck.
Yep.
You know, you've EQ'd or you've not EQ'd something and left it the way it is so that it could be on top in that guy's mix. Now you're stuck with that sound for all these other mixes. Very difficult.
Yeah, not to rabbit trail, but I know some of us remember, and it's still a functioning product, but the software audio console, which the one thing I always thought was kind of brilliant was the fact that you could make 16 monitor mixes with independent EQ. Basically, you could make a front house mix for everybody. I mean,
with that, you made 16 consoles.
Right. And because yeah, I mean, that was, I haven't done a ton of monitors, but I did enough to have a few battle scars from it. And that was always the big, huge limitation was, the guitar player's like, oh man, that vocal's really, really like, really trebly. And the singer's like, my vocal's really muddy. And I'm like, start splitting channels and you start running out of channel. You constantly run yourself in a circle. At least in front of house, there's one mix is enough. I don't know, completely different. Well, it's interesting though. Kind of circling back to the original topic, but the difference between are we just reinforcing what is there, or are we making it bigger than life for front of house? And then also same thing for monitors. And actually, I'm going to throw it back to Jason only because I know that you've done a bunch of in-ear mixing. How often is that like they don't really want reinforcement of what's there? They want some sort of like larger.
They want a monitor mix.
And that's very frustrating with a lot of performers because I've stood there and watched night after night as a singer struggles to stay on pitch and doesn't even know it because they, a great example is want too much low end in their mix. They like it to sound fat, make it fatter, and it's pulling them flat.
Mm-hmm.
And when you try to correct it, they don't like it. No, put it back the way it was. And so you get this self-perpetuating problem. And in another case, and what you mentioned, Brian, when I went digital finally in the early 2000s, and then eventually ended up on a Pro 9 system on Dolly, I had 14 people on deck. And there were a number of channels that I was multiple assigning them to strips so that I could do separate processing. And a great example there is when you're working with a fiddle player with in-ears, there's bone induction involved. Fiddle players, a lot of them like their instrument to sound very fat and present like it does right here. So if you give them that, you end up with a fiddle that sounds like a cello to everyone else. And so that brings into the question, the perspective. To the fiddle, that's reinforcement. To everyone else, it's bigger than life.
They should just play the viola if they want to do that,
Right. But you understand what I mean? Like we even have to define what is embellishing the sound. Maybe to one listener, it's an embellishment, but to another, it sounds like it should. It sounds like I perceive it in real life. And I think this topic relates to another one that's come up about it's good for engineers to go periodically, I think, to a symphony hall and hear things the way they sound versus hearing things the way engineers interpret they should sound. Just as kind of a mental reset.
100%.
Yeah, it's a reference point.
Or go on stage with your band playing with everything off.
Yes. Stand in front of the guitar rig. Stand in front. Now, I used to do that a lot, actually. Part of, I think, why I had such good relationships with my musicians was during sound checks and rehearsals, I'd pop out my ears and walk right up there and we'll just walk around the stage and listen. And they caught that right away within a day or two when I was new on the job. And they're like, all right, cool. All right. I see what you're doing.
Yeah. One of the big revelations for me doing monitors was realizing that this is back on wedges, but realizing that even with the listed wedge, you still weren't hearing what they were hearing because you weren't standing where they were standing. Mm-hmm. And so often the requests were just like, well, I really don't understand that from where I am, but if that's what you're asking for, then, here you go.
And the anxieties of artists, like there was one I was out with for a while and she ended up going solo. So she had no band to boost up her confidence on stage. And so we went from a 2 wedge and side fill situation to 4 wedges around her and side fills. But like the side fills didn't have vocals in them, but they had guitars. But then in the wedges too had, like it got really weird because now she just had anxiety about the way she sounded. And that's it goes back to going out on stage and just hearing what they're hearing. But Jason, you sparked an interesting connected rabbit hole to Brian's, which is the personal mixing for stage monitors. Mm-hmm. But also now there's apps that some of the larger tours are doing where the audience can personal mix on their Apple devices. So what do we feel about those two things?
I just think it's fabulous. I think that everybody who has never mixed anything ever in their entire lives should just be able to do all the mixing. Because
you can set thresholds. But you can set thresholds like, I don't know. I saw one demo of it for, I think it was the Rolling Stones. I don't know. But it was actually quite, I thought it was effective. But I'm a sound guy.
I'm joking. It's going to reinforce the idea that anyone could be a mixer. We all have that problem anyway. A lot of audience people, why can't I hear this? Or why don't you bring this up? Now everyone can just mix for themselves. So, it solves that problem.
Yeah, I will say that, if it makes the guitar player's girlfriend stop bugging me, then that's fine. I think it's I don't know. I think it's cool in a one way, but then I also think, part of concert experience is the shared experience. Part of it is, so it's like, I think it takes some of that away. But I remember that there's an install that's probably going bankrupt now in Vegas. I'm forgetting where it's not Caesars, but it's one of the bigger. But they were putting in a theater where every single seat has its own 9-1 system, like a wraparound.
That's
Love, isn't it?
That's Love.
Yeah, that's
Beatles
Love at the Mirage.
And it's that whole kind of personal complete. Now I think everybody's getting the same mix, but you're also getting an immersive experience just for you. And I think, okay, that's cool, but it also now cuts me off from the same experience that everybody. I don't know. There's
a name for that kind of self-pleasuring.
Well, and now in the age of COVID-19, that brings to mind the experience is going to be more separated anyway.
Personalized, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe they were on the right track inadvertently, maybe not. But
I think that term
doesn't that kind of isolating experience go against what music's supposed to do live? If you got that surround system, that's really great, but that goes to the whole thing of kids now don't put on music and sit around in a room and listen to it. They have it in their headphones and they're walking around in their own universe.
Yeah. But it's people don't just it's not just kids. Like people turn on televisions and don't watch the television. It's just something that's on in the room, how many times, how often do you hear it in the background when you're talking to somebody on the phone? Or
so we're going to have to support that. But is that actually something that should be supported? This isolation when you're live?
Yeah, the term experience has been used a couple of times now. And ultimately, this is all going more towards, the attendee experience, or that term seems to be becoming more of a focus point of what these events are, their experiences, and that's what they're selling as an experience. And, the more, I guess, disconnected from reality those experiences can be, maybe that's what people are going after. This comes back to, are we reinforcing or are we creating something more than the sum of its parts kind of thing? You go to, we got a club here, and I'm sure there's plenty of them. There's one place in DC here called Echo Stage, and it's just like as much of an audio assault on your senses as any club can be. And that's what they're going for. That's, there's all the chemical enhancements, I guess you could say, that seem to go along with that culture. So people are looking to get out of their when they're sitting there with their headphones on, by being around other people that are all doing the same thing, even though they may be in isolation, just because they can't even talk to the person next to them because it's so stupid loud. Not that there's anything wrong with it being stupid loud if that's what they're going after, but communication is not, necessarily, the shared experience there is just that you're in the same room with all these people. It may not necessarily be that you're all hearing the exact same thing or, perceiving the exact same thing. Because everybody's there to do a different thing. I mean, they may be there to hang out with their friends versus sing with band or the DJ or the
and that's
EMD
no less
guy,
valid. That's no less valid than any other format that's impressed on them. I mean, that they go to a concert and they hear what the concert provides, and if it's a more personal or more isolated environment, I don't think that's any.
Well, and I don't think we're acknowledging. We're not acknowledging here that there are a whole lot of other factors involved with group activities. There's pheromones and smells, and there's some very primal things going on there that have a lot less to do, I think, with sound than we're giving them credit for.
But they have to do with the perception of the sound, though.
They do. Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
That's part of
then, are you guys going to accept that the future with COVID-19 means that people are going to have VR headsets? They're never even going to go into a venue, but they will attend a concert and be able to look around and see avatars of all their people in there. And it's completely isolated. So you're sitting in your living room, and now, as Jason
Not as long
said,
as
you have
young
none of the
kids.
interaction.
If those youngsters want to pay money to go sweat together, there's going to be somebody willing to take that money.
100%.
Yeah, I agree. It's not forever. And, I don't think the live concert experience or whatever that is a unique experience. And I think that it'll still be around. The form will change, and it is changing. Technology is changing it. But like they said, getting together a bunch of people in one room, that's still something unique.
Which is what we got into this business to do. At least I think everybody that has done live things. Now we're getting close to the end of my usual cutoff time. I already have had people complain, but we were just getting going. But always leave them wanting more. I don't think I've heard Scott say a word. So, Scott, you have to.
That happened once before too.
You're gonna have
the best thing to say at the end.
This is the second time.
Say something.
It is the second time, but that's all right. In this particular discussion, I did not have a lot to add simply because of the difference in experience level. But we have the same thing. I mean, everybody wants the bass artificially tilted to give that larger than life experience, and it screws up the whole mix, and everything gets muddy, and you turn it down and they come running at you. So I mean, at every level, I think we have the same challenges with the artists, and I'm starting to work with some of those folks on the way down. In fact, just before the COVID hit, we did a 70s cruise with all sorts of folks, people that are old enough to remember, used to have heard of, and Cheap Trick was on the headline. So it was interesting to hear your stories about them and to keep my mouth shut, because let's just say it was a less than stellar show. So you guys are, and I was really excited about having them on our lineup, and I'm like, wow, this is somebody most people have heard of, and it wasn't where it should be, but I'm lucky enough that I get to work with a lot of bands over and over, especially the touring corporate wedding acts that which is really a whole different thing. I mean, a band playing for a group of corporate execs after a meeting or a wedding experience, and we're not talking about local wedding bands. I mean, we're talking again, these are folks like Can Function out of California, if you know them, and stuff. And it's really, I've been seeing them over and over, and artistically, I know what they want. They smile when they see us. And it's all relational, and sometimes it's the smallest little thing, and some people are good at communicating what they want, and some people you got to drag it out of them. And you still don't achieve what they want because they don't have the vocabulary.
A lot of times they only know what they don't want.
Yeah.
What's that?
And
a lot of times they only know what they don't want.
Correct.
One of the most frustrating positions to be in the whole audio business, I think, is to be a monitor engineer with a singer who can sit at that piano and come up with 50 different ways to describe how blue the sky is, who can't describe the first thing about what he wants to hear out of that wedge. I spent a year and a half miserable with a guy like that.
Because
Just
they're too close to
miserable.
the emotion. It's like being in a relationship and you can't understand, it's like they're so close to their art that, I don't know. Sometimes they don't know.
I will say at a very, very tiny level, I've spent just enough time on the other end of the microphone cable to know, and I'm relatively stable-ish, emotionally stable-ish kind of person. I'm not super, super artsy, which is why I do sound for a living. But it gets weird when you're on stage. Like it gets weird, and you have this thing of like, oh man, that thing you did last night in my in-ears, Jason, it was like perfect. Like it just felt so good. So then Jason goes recall, and then they walk out and go, and it could literally be like, because I had a burrito for lunch instead of like nothing, because it's all, it's all subjective and interconnected,
Could I throw something in here to hopefully tie this all together?
I love
the
that.
idea was larger than life or not larger than life or whatever. I've done, admittedly, a very few shows where things have fallen into place where the PA system just literally disappeared. And you look at the stage and you hear somebody singing and you see somebody singing and that's it. That to me is the ideal. And in fact, my personal ideal of what a sound system should sound like is actually based on a trio singing in our driveway when I was growing up on a farm in PEI in the 70s with no sound system. So that's my ideal. And you can achieve it, but things like timing and tuning of the PA system are so critical because it has to start with the idea that you're dealing with reinforcing humans, and really have to start with the idea that the band is time zero. And so that as the sound comes from the band, it meshes with the sound coming from the PA system on its way, all in time and everything. And that to me is really the reinforcement experience as it should be. And to get back to your point about why it was perfect last night and it's not tonight, is if the venue has changed and those relationships have changed, then what that artist is hearing in their ears, because they can hear so much of what's happening in the hall, that's going to be a kind of part of the issue. So it's trying to get that organic feel happening. That's really, really the challenge in this business.
Yeah, I think ultimately when you're talking about trying to draw some sort of either or between, are we doing sound reinforcement or are we doing sound enhancement? I think, and it's funny because this is, I think, the answer to every single one of these shows that I've done. And it's, we're kind of doing both, because the enhancement experience may actually be exactly what reinforces what it is that the artist is trying to do in the first place. So you're actually just reinforcing what it is that they're trying to do. Any last thoughts from anybody before we say sayonara until Thursday evening?
That was a lot of great stuff.
No, but thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Lots of great
Great
stuff.
discussion. Thanks.
Sorry, Henry.
Great discussion. Thank all of you guys for taking a little bit of time out of your afternoons or mornings or wherever you are in Canada. I don't know.
We'll fight about consoles next time.
We will fight about consoles. I guarantee you, it's gonna come up.
X32.
Hey, don't. It's you can't change topics.
Keep muted.
Form over function.
Form over function. All right. I promise you that console favorite will be one of the choices on
Genies.
So if you guys come back on Thursday and enough people voted up, then you can all hear about why Yamaha consoles blow everybody else out of the water. With that,
Nova-san.
let's all say goodbye to our YouTubes.